just one question I'd like one of you to answer, and maybe say, how did your collaboration come about? How did it happen that you in Montreal found Samah in Melbourne? I have all my life grown up with the idea that Montreal was the capital, the real capital of Jewish culture following the Second World War. It was because of a famous Jewish writer who was the father of a famous Australian artist. So I had in my house this whole concept of Jewish culture exists now in Montreal. So when I first read about this collaboration, I thought, what a coincidence. But perhaps you'll tell us the real story of how it happened.
All right, well, I'll start and then pass it on to Samah. I served several terms on the board, the executive of Playwrights Guild of Canada and Playwrights Canada Press, and the Sperm Count, which is the anthology play, is the second in a trilogy of plays that I've written about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict from a diaspora perspective. And so I approached the publisher of Playwrights Canada Press, Annie Gibson, about an anthology by diaspora writers, Palestinian and Jewish, that tackle either the Israeli-Palestinian conflict directly or Jewish-Palestinian relations in the diaspora, and she went for it. And so I realized right away that I wasn't going to be able to pull this off without having a Palestinian co-editor. And I also felt I needed a woman's voice to give authenticity. So I went on a Google search for a Palestinian woman playwright. Anywhere in the world I could find her. And I'll tell you, my lucky star was just there when the name Samah Sabawi came up. And, I wrote to Samah, I read a little bit about her plays. She had a couple plays produced in Ottawa, and that she was working on a new play. And so I wrote her, I asked her if I could read the plays, and I sent her the copy of Sperm Count so she could get a sense of my artistic vision on the conflict. And now she'll take over.
So I'm minding my own business at home, and I get an email from this guy in Montreal.
A bit louder.
And he tells me that he is interested in reading my scripts, and he's sending me a script titled Sperm Count. And then I started looking him up and Googling him, and I found that he was a very well-established playwright, and at the time I hadn't yet staged Tales of a City by the Sea, so I felt a little bit insecure in my abilities. And I thought, why would he reach out to me? And then I thought, okay, it's because he's Mossad, obviously. Which I thought he wasn't afterwards when we talked and started working on this, until I saw him speaking in, what language was that in the street the other day?
Oh, Chinese.
Chinese. So now I'm confused again. But anyway, so I read his play, and I loved the idea, and we had a chat and another chat, and I also thank my lucky stars that I agreed to do this project and to co-edit and to create this space and to really crack open this conversation about working together and about how we can do it, how we can find a positive way to find allies across the divide and to get the stories out in any way possible. So I'm glad I've done it. And we are like in week, 6 of our book tour?
That's right.
We haven't killed each other yet.
But in the first year, well, until Samah came to Montreal on April 16th or so, something like that, in that year and a half, almost 2 years before, we only met in person once for an hour in Montreal. Everything was done by Skype and email.
Amazing. I wonder if you could, well, I will approach Stephen first, putting the gentleman before the ladies, and ask you, what question do you most frequently get asked at these gatherings? Well, either of you, some of them.
Well, I think the first question is
Yeah.
how we met, which we've dealt with. I think the second question, people seem to be very interested in our editorial journey, how we selected the plays, and what those challenges were. So, do you want to begin, Samah? Or
You can begin.
all right. It didn't take us very long. I think it really solidified our trust in each other. Wasn't we weren't sitting down together, but weren't Skyping and putting a list of principles up, okay? The trust came from reading our plays, and we knew our artistic vision. But out of that came an organic we were on the same page that what we wanted this anthology to do was not simply to peek over cultural walls dividing us. We wanted to have a collection of plays that bridged the cultural divide and offer a vision of peace and justice for Palestine, for the Middle East, and for the world. A play that was going to speak not just to Jews and Palestinians, but to humanity. So I think that was the overriding principle in choosing the plays, but it didn't mean we were going to choose plays that were free of conflict or plays that, didn't tackle the really tough issues. We wanted plays that varied in comedy and drama, that varied stylistically between realism and the surreal, plays that varied between being set in Palestine and Israel and in the diaspora. And of course, our characters had to deliver different voices, different opinions and different perspectives. That's what drama is. So these were the challenges that we had, and we also had to deal with the issue of authenticity of voice. And these are dramaturgical issues that we had to find plays that delivered characters that were true to their times and to their culture. So I'll pass this on to you, Samah.
Yeah, and we wanted plays that didn't present characters as one-dimensional kind of, Can you? Okay. I thought you were going, yay! Doing a dance in the back. Yeah, so we wanted to make sure that our characters were not one-dimensional characters, were not stereotypical, and that the stories were told in a way that is appealing and beautiful and humane. But I think one of the challenges, and there were many, but one of them that stood out for me was in looking for Palestinian plays in particular by Palestinian playwrights. We were looking for plays written in English and staged and had a production. And I think that was a little bit difficult and limiting because Palestinian writers will write both in English and Arabic as well as all the other languages that they speak in the diaspora. And it's really hard, and I, as a Palestinian playwright, can vouch for that. It's really hard to get a play staged that is written by a Palestinian in a Western theater. So that was a little bit difficult. The other difficulty, and we encountered it once in a spoken format, but I'm sure there were other more silent forms of rejections, where some people, on both sides, the Jewish and the Palestinian, didn't want to be in a collaborative project for all the things that this collaboration could mean. So there is great mistrust, obviously, on both sides. And for me personally, there was one very prominent Palestinian playwright that I spoke to, and she said to me that she knew that this was not normalization, that a project that would be normalization is one which would aim to normalize the occupation and the injustice and just bring two sides together, and nothing really happens, and everybody goes home at the end. But even though she knew that this was not the case, she was saying, and I think her point is valid to a certain extent, that it was time for Palestinian voices to stand alone without having to justify being heard by always having to have a Jewish voice next to them. And there is validity in that, and I don't think that having a voice and a Palestinian voice that stands alone means that you can't also find allies across the divide and work with them and have a unified voice that reaches out towards a better peace, towards a better world, towards justice. So these were some of the other challenges off the top of my head that we faced in bringing together this collection.
I'll just add one other point. From the Jewish perspective, I think some of you may have a sense of just how many Jewish playwrights there are in North America, and probably a share in Australia, although I'm not that familiar here. And yet you can count perhaps 24 in the global Jewish diaspora of Jewish playwrights who have tackled and penned plays that have been produced professionally. So, and this is for various reasons. I mean, some of the reasons have to do with people don't want, that some playwrights don't want to write political plays. Some of them feel that it's too angst-ridden a topic. But far too many do it for career reasons or for partisan reasons. And so, even though there are so many Jewish, American, and Canadian playwrights, there are very few who have actually penned plays that have been produced about the conflict.
I'm quite interested in the juxtaposition that we've got here of Jewish diasporan and Palestinian diasporan, because not quite exactly an equivalence in the same way. When you use the word diaspora, it's right, it's fine. But if we're using the word Palestinian, the other is, to me, Israeli, of course. Now, but they are not part of the diaspora, and you were talking about writers mainly who are writing, as I understand it, in the diaspora. What about the Israeli writers? And I'm talking specifically about probably the best play we saw in Israel in the last few years, David Grossman. No, he's written it in Hebrew. We saw it in the English translation, but I think it was with headphones. It wasn't an English production. But until the advent of our goddess, great goddess, the Minister of Culture, Miri Regev, there were plays that you could go to in the mainstream theatres in Israel, and this was the production at the Qamri that I'm thinking of in 2015. We're in 17, yes, 15, of an adaptation of David Grossman's To the End of the Earth, which was superb.
And it was great.
And I'm just wondering how do you deal with this?
And it's a great novel, David Grossman's.
And the adaptation
it's wonderful,
is superb.
Yeah. But David Grossman is an Israeli playwright. Right. And the way we look, the way I look at the diaspora, the definition is not Jews living outside of Israel. The definition of diaspora is Jews living outside of the ancestral homeland. So unless you want to make a case that Jews didn't come from that part of the world, you know, that's the definition that we use. Okay, it's not Jews who live outside of the state of Israel, but outside of the ancestral homeland. So we chose to do a book, an anthology of plays that gave a diaspora perspective, and we realized that diaspora perspective, it offers the playwrights both privilege and a more diverse prism through which to look at the conflict, because many of us live in multicultural societies. Go ahead.
And look, what I said before about language being a minefield, and there are so many layers to answer what you've just suggested. But one of them is to say that diaspora is a word we use for the lack of a better term. It is not exactly accurate when we talk about the Palestinians either. It was, I think Edward Said was one of the first voices that said do not use the word diaspora because we are not a community that has chosen to leave or has been just born in a natural state outside of the homeland. We are exiled. We are denied the right of return. So even the use of the term diaspora with itself to apply to the Palestinians is a contentious term, and we're perfectly aware of it. So I think we're just using it for the lack of a better term, and in its more generalized meaning, in its more generalized sense of Palestinians and Jews who are, in our case, Canadian, Palestinian, Jewish diasporic communities,
And
which really is a simplified way to deal with it, but it is a very complex word, and there's a lot of layers to it. Why?
I'm sorry, excuse me.
Sorry, why not have Israeli voices? Because what is the equivalent to Israeli voices when there is no state of Palestine in existence, when Palestinians have no right to return, when there are no Palestinian citizens living in a place where they can have access to the theaters? I just said some of the issues that my Palestinian colleagues in Gaza and in the West Bank face when trying to put on a play. There is no equivalence. Between the word Israeli and Palestinian, there's no, you can't really put them together on the same level.
Just to elaborate a little bit further, when I was discussing, because it's amazing how ideas, I know this happens in science, but it's fascinating when it happens in cultures. Suddenly it appeared, and it didn't appear suddenly, it was coming all together, but last year was, I would say, the year of Palestinian diaspora, when suddenly there were publications all over the place.
Yeah, and you've got one right there.
Yeah, exactly. and this week in Palestine, I don't know if any of you are aware of it, devoted in October last year a whole issue to the diaspora. And I was discussing this with Sonny Mayo, the publisher, in East Jerusalem, exactly when this came out. And he said that the Israelis object, we're talking about intellectuals, people that are talking in the literary world. When the Palestinians use the capital letter for diaspora, he said some of them will claim that the capital diaspora belongs to Jewry, and Palestinian is part of the general term diaspora. At least that's how he has perceived the...
In fact, in the dictionary, it's often referred to in capital D as the Jewish diaspora.
That's what
we
Sonny
made
says.
A point in our anthology to capitalize both.
Well, I did too.
And I'll just mention that what you've brought out about David Grossman is a point that I've tried to emphasize in my introductory comments, that it's kosher for an Israeli playwright to write a play and get it staged in Israel, and even in some theaters, even some Jewish theaters in America, some that are critical of treatment of Palestinians of the occupation. But diaspora playwrights are targeted specifically. And there's a lot of complex reasons why that occurs that are much broader than just the artistic world. It has everything to do with American support for Israel and the role of diaspora Jews in reinforcing that support, that financial support. So it's a very, but it's just a point to highlight.
You see this in the discourse also. I mean, the very, very much the discourse in Israel, you have a group that you can talk with and criticize and feel comfortable with. And that becomes very small, this group of people, when you're in the diaspora, because of the questions of washing your dirty linen in public, not showing solidarity, and so on. So it mirrors every part.
But I will
Isn't it
say,
also relative to the size of the population?
Well, I think I don't know. Is it?
Just wondering.
I found that
Because when you look at the actual peace camp in Israel,
Yes.
it is still very marginal relative to the size of the population.
oh, I'm not talking about the peace camp. I'm talking about general discussion. I mean, it's like we can discuss Australian politics and be very critical Australian, and nobody gets called an anti-Australian or an anti. When you're in the country, when you criticise your government, I mean, everybody will criticise it, and different aspects of it. Whether they do anything about it is another thing. But you have newspapers that are critical voices. I mean, big newspapers, ours, which is a major newspaper, which will write many critical articles without any problems. But
Come out to the diaspora.
but come to the
world.
diaspora, no, and you start quoting Haaretz, it's not. It's a different matter, and that maybe is the defensiveness of Jews who want to idealise or whatever. That's the same, and I think to some extent you get fossilised, and I'd like your comments on fossilised views. What I call fossilised views. In the communities, probably amongst both, although I know the Jewish community better than the Palestinian, people whose ideas about what they think, the idea of Palestine, the idea of Israel, is anchored in something else, maybe in the past, maybe in their childhood or whatever, and they are reluctant to let go.
I will offer a bit of a historical perspective also. Part of the image of the diaspora political point of view is promoted in the media by the large organizations that are viewed as the spokespersons for the Jewish community, and they tend to be lock, stock, and barrel in support of Israel in a very dogmatic one-way point of view. But there are plenty of progressive Jews who don't have that stage, who don't have the access to the media, who agree with me on the issue. But something that is very positive, and I think a game changer in the long run, is social media. Now, social media, there are a lot of problems with it. But the fact is that it offers a more democratic and diverse perspective and a mass expression of points of view that are not dictated by those who control the large media establishments, that are very much incorporated within the broader corporate world. So, I think that this is part of the reason why we can see a shift. And you can also, there is also some changes in terms of the generational attitude of younger Jews who don't see Israel as a safety net that their parents and grandparents had. That the Holocaust is no longer told by Holocaust survivors. It's stories that must be told, but they're stories. And so you do have a younger generation that is drawn to the social media. And so I think the prospects for change, is occurring. And the fact that social media is bringing out many of the stories of the degree of oppression that daily Palestinians are experiencing. And that's something that as playwrights, as storytellers, we have to feed into, because it's stories of people. We have to put aside the maps and the statistics and all that, and we have to tell stories of people. So I'm optimistic that change is on the horizon, and Palestinian resilience is what is inspiring us.
I think I'll just add to that. Social media has done a great job in educating, and it's also done a great job in polarizing. And I think we need to be aware of that. But I think just reading today the reflection section by the playwrights in the anthology, I think Natasha Greenblatt and you, as well as Naomi Wallace, they've all referred to the 2009 bombing of Gaza. So I think it's not just that we are able to access the news, it's that the Israeli aggression has become a little bit harder for Jewish members of the diaspora communities to bear, to stand, to look at, to see. 2014 Gaza changed many people, broke many hearts, and opened many eyes. And I think the continuation of the occupation to the point where it's at today, Netanyahu's policies of expand, 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 the death of the two-state solution, all of these things are incredibly important in the way they've had an impact on the younger generation of Jewish young people growing up in the diaspora. And so it's a combination of things, and I think times are changing. They're not changing fast enough, but they are changing, and I'm also hopeful because we don't really have a choice but to be hopeful.
And this exposure of the Trump-Netanyahu love fest. I mean, I just read an article yesterday about how since Trump has been elected, the number of Jews who are joining synagogues and going to synagogues are rising at an incredible rate. People are looking, they have huge questions, and they're looking for solutions. Now, this is not the ultra-Orthodox synagogues, but the Reform synagogues in America, and the Reconstructionist synagogues, and even the conservative synagogues. You're seeing this. And you know, to see how Netanyahu is hitching his carriage to the Trump horse, you know, I'll just stop there.
If we could move on just onto a similar topic, but from the other side. Social media, as you say, gives voice to many different factions in it. And one of the things that's also interesting is what is happening with the Palestinians, because we know that they don't speak with one voice. It's not a monolithic entity. And the problems of the Palestinians have been always canvassed very widely, but there is a particular issue that I thought you might speak to, and this is the normalization one, because this is really one of the biggest elephants in the room, because it's defined in different ways by different people. There is the official one, but I've taken out a couple of different versions of it. What I'm interested in particular, is with the election of the joint list, something that I promise you, at the beginning of 2015, everybody told me would be impossible. If it did get elected in any large numbers, it would die. It didn't die. It has grown, it has become quite a strong voice within Israeli-Palestinian, as well as Jewish, because there are Jews that vote for the joint list, and I'm not the only one. There were 7 in our electoral district, would you believe, of North Tel Aviv. I mean, they did the analysis to that degree. So I kept wondering, you know, where are the other 6 in my neighborhood? But in fact, it has a growing following. It has, Ayman Odeh has done a very good job in promoting Israeli-Palestinian interests. But the problem comes when we talk about normalization, and how is this being dealt with in terms of attitudes to collaboration in literature, in music, and so on. We've got a very good example in one of the plays, The Peacemaker, and it's just fantastic because it's also based on a factual situation.
Yeah, absolutely.
We know it happened, and no matter how bizarre any of the plays are, I promise you, I know these incidents happened, and the more bizarre, the more real.
Yeah. Okay, so I support full-heartedly the Palestinian civil society's call for boycotts, divestments, and sanctions. And when we started working on this project, it was very important for me from the get-go that the project, that my participation in it, and that the work, the outcome, is something that would be in line with civil society's call. So we would not be stepping over the picket line that was drawn by the Palestinian civil society in their call for BDS. And there is plenty of spaces like these where you can actually work together in a co-struggle, a co-resistance, whatever you want to call it, within the arts and within any other section. I think I like to be able to model what I believe, and that's what you see here. What is normalization? Normalization is, according to the guidelines of the Boycott, Divestments and Sanctions on their website, if I can remember from the top of my head, normalization is taking on any projects that has official Israeli funding. So if you're dealing with a university, if you're dealing with an institution, if you're dealing with a film, if you're dealing with any kind of anything that really receives official Israeli funding, or is done in order to brand the Israel name, to whitewash the occupation, to justify the subjugation of the Palestinians, or to put Palestinians and Israelis as two equal parties to a conflict, when the conflict is not equal, it's one of occupied and occupier. So these are the general guidelines. I think where it comes to Palestinians who are citizens of the State of Israel, whether they are participating in political life or in music festivals or whatever, the guidelines are a little bit different for them because they're not living outside. So the guidelines are for us people on the outside who have the luxury of not working in an Israeli institution or refusing Israeli funding or refusing collaboration at any level. Whereas if you're living inside the Palestinian, inside the 1948 Israeli borders, the expectation is very different. And in fact, there are very different guidelines altogether for what is expected or requested of people who adhere to the BDS call.
Do you think we could talk a little bit about the peacemaker? Because I think it is a very good illustration of this problem, and it's a real problem.
Sure.
I mean, people get murdered, people get killed, theatres get closed, and it's this extreme version of political normalization on the West Bank, not accepted by many Palestinians, but only by some who feel that this is very important. And perhaps you tell us a little bit more about the play and how this gets translated into the cultural sphere.
So the dramatic issue with in the play The Peacemaker, which is in the anthology, is Sophia, I think the name of the character, who is a Jewish American Jewish Canadian visiting she goes actually on a birthright trip to Israel, and from there she goes to volunteer with an NGO as a music teacher in the West Bank. And while she's in the West Bank, she doesn't reveal to them that she is Jewish, even though if she did, and I know a lot of Jewish people who go and volunteer in the West Bank, and even in Gaza, it's not a big deal. It's actually, they welcome people of any creed who would go and share their pain and tell their stories. But in this particular play, she ends up organizing a concert for the Palestinian students and takes them to this concert, which is in Jerusalem, and she's playing in an old people's home to Israelis who are...
To Jewish Holocaust
survivors.
Again, Holocaust.
But they're Israelis, right?
Yes,
right.
Okay,
Israel, yes.
so to Israelis. And I think when she goes back, she does this even though knowing she's not supposed to. And so when she goes back, the school gets, the director of the school, who's the father of the girl that she ends up taking with her on this concert, gets very upset because she has overstepped the boycott line. She has normalized with Israel. She has taken his students, and she has really blackened his name within the communities, and he's become known as a normalizer as a result of this. So that's the issue in the play, and I think it does speak to the truth of the situation over there, and Natasha leaves it up to the reader to understand the complexity of what she's done, and the issue of what she's done. And her naivety and disrespect, really, of the Palestinian culture, the Palestinian, the Palestinian, and deceit for the Palestinian family that she is staying with, and lack of understanding of the consequence of her action. She thinks that just by taking the children to this concert, that she's creating some kind of a bridge for peace between two people. Now, the reason this is frowned upon in the West Bank is because ever since Oslo began, the Oslo process, there were so many projects under the whole peace banner where they brought Palestinian and Israelis together in the football field, in concerts, in schools, in excursions, in outings, and they would have Palestinians and Israelis as if knowing each other was enough to stop the structural, the discrimination, the systematic structure of discrimination that crushes the lives of the Palestinians. And at the end of these concerts, the Palestinians, as in this story, they go back through the checkpoints, back to their Bantustan, area where they can't get out again except with another permit, if bestowed upon them by the Israeli soldiers or by the Israeli authorities. And they're back in their prisons. And the Israelis feel good about themselves for actually sitting with the Palestinians and talking to them. And so after years and years and years of having these peace projects and this peace industry, and having the Palestinians seeing that they were losing land every day, they were losing resources every day, the settlements were expanding, the peace process was going nowhere, they came to understand that they really have to do something. And that's when Palestinian civil society's call for boycotts, divestments, and sanctions started. And they outlined what normalization is. I think I've covered it, yeah?